Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have gathered for the prestigious Professor Dr. R.P. Anand Memorial Lecture. Dr. Anand was an international legal scholar and a pioneer of developing countries' approaches to international law. He wrote extensively on the law of the sea, international adjudication and the birth of the states, and the sovereign equality of states. This lecture commemorates the life and works of Dr. Anand. For this lecture, we have with us Professor Dr. Bharat Desai. He holds the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru Chair in International Environmental Law, as well as he is the Professor of International Law. He is also the Chairman of Center for International Legal Studies in School of International Studies of Jawaharlal Nehru University. He serves as the Editor-in-Chief of the Environmental Policy and Law. Thank you, sir, for gracing us with your presence. I'd like to request Professor Dr. S.G. Srijit, Executive Dean, Jindal Global Law School, for the welcome address. Please, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. I really appreciate you coming here on a day when you had your classes with no reciprocal expectations, but for the knowledge you're going to get by listening to this lecture. This is a great moment for some of us, because in this room, if I count you as my students, we are fourth generation of teachers and students. We have Professor Bharat Desai, who actually is a student of Professor R.P. Anand, both registrar and I, students of Professor Desai, and you, our students. So it's a great moment in that sense. Registrar and I also had the opportunity to be taught by Professor R.P. Anand, which we consider as a great honor. And of course, we were also taught by Professor Bharat Desai 2 decades back. Thank you very much to everybody for joining here. Let me start with a little bit of history, and I'll try to connect actually Professor Anand with Professor Bharat Desai so that I set a context for this lecture. A little bit of history here. You know that when the Constituent Assembly of India decided to accept the universality of international law by incorporating 2 articles in the Constitution, Article 51 and Article 253. So that was the espousal by the Constituent Assembly of international law. We decided to accept the universality of international law. So in a sense, our acceptance was something between a full acceptance of international law and a full subscription to post-colonial resistance. That means that we didn't fully accept the universality of international law, which we believed at that point was Eurocentric, nor we went into a full-fledged post-colonial discourse. But rather, India found itself somewhere sandwiched between this wholesome acceptance of international law or wholesome acceptance of the post-coloniality. And actually, this era, from 1947 onwards till 1980s, that could be called as the Anand era. The era when Professor R.P. Anand, an epistemologically motivated young scholar, a student of Professor Quincy Wright from Yale Law School, returned to India and joined as a professor in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Anand had to make a rational choice at that point, whether to accept the universality of international law or whether to stand outside the framework of international law and engage in an external critique, complete surrender and dedication to the post-colonial discourse. So he had to make a rational choice. And Professor Anand at that point made the choice that it was a rational choice that we'll stand within the well-established boundaries of international law. That means there'll be no external critique of international law. Rather, we'll stay within international law and critique it. Engage in a kind of a dialectic conversation with international law, which at that time was badly Eurocentric. In other words, this can be called as he wanted to critique international law from the belly of the beast. There's a beautiful expression used by one of my ex-colleague, Professor Prabhakar Singh, that Professor Anand made the rational choice to critique international law from the belly of the beast. Now, the idea is not to give India a position in international law. So he never made a bargain saying that we are also here, give us a chance within your Eurocentric international law, because he didn't want to become part of that Eurocentric imagination which prevailed at that point in time. But he believed that he believed in the transformative power of international law. He believed that it's a transformative paradigm, and he thought that by being within international law, as international law will evolve, he'll be able to transform the reality, because at that point, a new India had to be developed. And then Professor Anand spoke. I'm meaning figuratively. Professor Anand spoke at that point. He believed in a new international law that we'll fashion out of the Eurocentric international law. And that international law, he used the two terminologies that will be inter-civilizational and that will be inter-geographic. He wanted new voices, new consciousness to prevail over there. And he considered that that new consciousness will be the Asian consciousness and the African consciousness in international law. And Professor Anand went on to write two celebrated articles which still remain masterpieces in that field. The first one, The Role of New Asian African Countries in the Present International Legal Order, published in 1962 in American Journal of International Law, which still is a masterpiece. And thus Professor Anand became the first Indian to publish in the frighteningly distinguished American Journal of International Law. Subsequent to that, in 1966, he went on to speak about the role of Asian and African states in the International and Comparative Law Quarterly, published by the British Society of International and Comparative Law. And that article he titled, Attitude of the Asian African States Towards Certain Problems of International Law. So from the general Asian consciousness, he transformed that into a particular voice, and he started to address the problems of international law using that Asian consciousness. So these two papers, one in American Journal of International Law and other in International and Comparative Law Quarterly, today remain masterpieces. Now at that point, if you look at Professor Anand's approach, I would dare to call it, that was actually a Delhi School of International Law. Today we speak about Frankfurt School of International Law, we speak about Harvard School, we speak about Chicago School, but there existed at that point, even though it didn't get the kind of deserving attention, there was a Delhi School of Imagination in international law. Professor Anand, as I said, he did not reject international law per se. He did accept the form of international law, but he did not accept the substance of it because he believed that substance to be deeply and abjectly Eurocentric. He tried to breathe a new life into international law. In fact, what he tried to do was that he wanted to localize international law. He wanted to create international law Indian, what today we may call as an Indian approach to international law. So it was a kind of an indigenization of international law, which Professor Anand did at that time. And that was a great beginning of an indigenous tradition in international law. He did not reject the normativity of international law. As I said, he believed in the form, he did not believe in the substance. But there was a rejection of the normativity that was European per se at that point. But he believed that, of course, a new normative trail, a new normative character could be attributed to this discipline. If you ask about what was his political stance at that point, he was very Nehruvian. He believed in the non-alignment policy of the Nehru, which means a neutral observer, a detached observer, who will decide whether to participate or not, and will participate when the time is ripe. So Professor Anand became that hopeful watcher, the detached observer, rather more than that. Hopeful watcher is more sanguine. A hopeful watcher who believed in the transformative power of international law and believed that the time will come when India will have a voice. There will be an Indian approach to international law. Now, this work done by Professor R.P. Anand was taken over by a set of young scholars after that. And of course, Professor Anand became a legacy. A tradition evolved out of it. C.J. Chako, K.R.R. Shastri, M.K. Nawaz, Nagendra Singh, Rahmatullah Khan, R.P. Dhokalia, and then, of course, four legends who came from JNU, Professor V.S. Mani, Professor Yogesh Tyagi, Professor B.S. Chimney, and last but not the least, Professor Bharat Desai. And Registrar and I, we had the fortune to be taught by all these four legends and also by Professor R.P. Anand. Now, about Professor Bharat Desai within this grand tradition, grand normative tradition, grand tradition which indigenized international law, which localized international law, which finally gave India a voice or an identity, which you can call as the Indian approach to international law. Now, Professor Desai writes from the withins of international law. He also doesn't engage in an external critique like Twail does. Rather, he believes in the sovereign equality of the states. He believes in the universality of international law, so he engages in a discourse which we can say within international law, the withins of international law. He explores the possibilities of a normative tradition which is doctrine-centered. Now, he has a faith, a deep faith, an unflinching faith that the interstate relations is a legal normative framework which has a certain morality to that. This is not like an unabashed acceptance of legal positivism, but actually a critical approach to that. Belief in the faith in the normativity of international law, at the same time you believe that there is a morality to the international norms. One example I'll give you here. I recently came across an article written by Professor Desai on apology, the role of apology in international relations, in interstate relationship. He explores the powers of apology for the past wrongs committed by the states. That means the past breaches of international law. It's not that it was an emotional argument or an argument which is purely based on certain sentiments and the emotions that emerged out of it, that states have a responsibility to apologize for the wrongs they did. But rather, this argument on the apology was located within the scope of the doctrine of state responsibility for internationally wrongful acts. And that's what I meant by the faith in normativity. You locate yourself within the possibilities of international law and then try to become transformative here. Now, to conclude this, his discourse is deeply positive, immensely pragmatic, and highly impactful. Whatever he wrote, be that on climate change, on sustainable development, on surgical strikes, on the general principles of international law, all those writings, as I said, they were optimistic. He doesn't fall prey to the abject nihilism that prevails today in the world. He was immensely pragmatic. He's immensely pragmatic, and his scholarship is highly impactful. He cares for the world, every beings in that world, and also the non-beings therein. He's a conservationist by consciousness, because he's an environmental law scholar and he has this deep conservationist empathies in him. He has an environmentalist empathy in his writings. And most importantly, there is a love for humanity that drives his life and work, which exactly is what Professor Anand taught his students, which we today try to learn from Professor Anand, Professor Desai, and from that glorious tradition. That's by way of setting a context. Well, I know that I'm just a small thing in the larger scheme of things. You're here not to listen to me. You're here to listen to Professor Bharat Desai. So with that, I welcome all of you to this distinguished lecture in honor of Professor Ram Prakash Anand. And once more, thank you for all the students and all the faculty members who made it possible today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Srijit, for your wonderful words. I'd like to request Professor Dabiru Sridhar Patnaik, Registrar, O.P. Jindal Global University, for the introductory remarks on the life and works of Dr. Anand.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the O.P. Jindal Global University, I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to this important event, the Professor R.P. Anand Memorial Lecture by none other than my teacher, Professor Bharat Desai, on the topic, I quote, "The era of planetary crisis, making international law work," unquote. I highly value the opportunity of speaking on this important occasion, and I wish to thank the Vice Chancellor, Professor C. Rajkumar, and the Executive Dean of the Jindal Global Law School, my friend and colleague, Professor Srijit, for entrusting me with the honor and onerous responsibility of introducing the scholarship of Professor R.P. Anand, my teacher and mentor. Over the years, as Professor Srijit rightly remarked, generations of international lawyers, fortunately including myself and Professor Srijit, benefited immensely from his writings, teaching and guidance at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and the Indian Society of International Law. Professor Anand was always generous with his time and advice to his students. On this occasion, I gratefully remember Professor Anand's wisdom and acts of kindness to me and join you all in paying my homage to his memory. As Professor Srijit spoke about his works and his contributions, Professor R.P. Anand is one of the pioneers of third world approaches to international law. If we were to decipher Professor R.P. Anand's contribution to international law within the context of a third world approach to international law, there are three strands, according to me, within the context of this particular approach. The first strand is the history of international law. The second strand is the International Court of Justice, followed by the law of the sea, and not necessarily in this order. He became, in effect, the institutional memory of the International Court of Justice and the negotiating history of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. These strengths remained with him throughout his long life. In a career spanning over 5 decades, Professor Anand authored or edited over 20 books and published more than 100 seminal articles two of which were alluded to by my colleague, Professor Srijit. And Professor Anand published these articles in professional journals all over the world that included the American Journal of International Law and the International and Comparative Law Quarterly. An alumnus of Delhi University and Yale Law School, where he studied under the supervision of the legendary Professor Myris McDougall, Professor Anand started his career at the Duke Law School and returned to India in the 1960s at the behest of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to join as reader and head of the Department of International Law of the then Indian School of International Studies, later merged with the Jawaharlal Nehru University and renamed as the School of International Studies. His contributions were vast, influential, and unmatched. Professor Anand was one of the few scholars from India to have become a member of the prestigious Institut de Droit International. In English, it is the Institute of International Law. Professor Anand also had the distinction of delivering the prestigious general course on international law on the topic, I quote, sovereign equality of states in international law, unquote, at the Hague Academy of International Law. We cannot trace here Professor Anand's distinguished career as an international lawyer in all its details, nor can we give a full account of his contribution to international law owing to the paucity of time. For Professor R.P. Anand's contribution to international law is a legion, and it merits a commemorative seminar or a panel to discuss his works at length. We can, however, recount some of his achievements and contributions that we know of with respect to the strands that I had just mentioned. The history of international law, the first strand. Professor R.P. Anand's extensive research extended to a wide variety of themes and topics of international law on history of international law and the third world. Professor Anand arrived on the international scene at a time when the geography of international law, to quote the well-chosen metaphor of late Judge Radha Binod Pal, was changing from a small group of Western nations to universality. The situation called for intellectual and thought leadership from a person who belonged to the new nations, and the mantle, as it were, fell on Professor Anand in the fight for a just international order. For instance, Professor Anand, in his book Development of Modern International Law in India, published in 2007, observes, I quote, to defend colonialism in the age of freedom is, to say the least, harping on the past European law, which was always unreasonable and challengeable, and now has altogether lost its validity. International law is no longer the exclusive preserve of the European countries or countries of European origin. It must change with the changing or changed times, unquote. In the 1960s, when third world states were treated as newcomers to the international family of nations, when third world voices were uncommon in the field of international law, he successfully and compellingly advocated the interrelationship of third world with international law. Professor R.P. Anand's scintillating mind was quick to absorb the essentials. In an earlier work on Asian states and the development of international law, 1972, Professor Anand states, and I quote, they, the Europeans, found themselves in the middle of a network of states and interstate relations based on traditions which were more ancient than their own and in no way inferior to notions of European civilization, unquote. As a devoted champion of interests of developing countries, Professor R.P. Anand's prescient mind was quick to see the contribution of Asian African countries to international law. This is where we can position works of Professor R.P. Anand on a historic timescale. As a sampler, I can mention Asian states and the development of a universal international law, sovereign equality of states in international law, confrontation or cooperation, international law and the developing countries, new states and international law, and studies in international law and history, an Asian perspective. Moving further to the second strand, the contribution to the international law of the sea regime. Professor Anand contributed immensely to the development of the law of the sea. His works in this area resulted in tracing the Indian maritime traditions and in unraveling the gaps and inequities that needed to be addressed as part of modernization of the law of the sea. And this probably led to his appointment as the legal consultant to the United Nations Secretary General on Law of the Sea. Lamenting over the state of affairs during the early years of the establishment of the Law of the Sea Tribunal, he observes that there is a lack of enthusiasm in accepting the jurisdiction of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which should have been or should have a great potential in the settlement of disputes relating to the law of the sea. However, here too, he does not shy away from the prospects for the developing states. He writes in The Legal Regime of the Seabed in Developing Countries, 1976, and I quote, "One of the greatest threats to the present international society arises from the wide and widening gap between the rich and the poor, the satiated and the hungry, the satisfied and the dissatisfied. While the poor and the underdeveloped countries could be easily ignored, bypassed, and suppressed in the early centuries, their emergence as full and independent members of the international society has now given them a new influence. Indeed, a vast majority of the present extended international society consists of these poor, underdeveloped, and turbulent states, well aware of their miserable condition and deeply concerned to do something about it. Mankind stands today at the threshold of a new frontier and a new source of untold wealth. It is hence to be seen how this wealth can be used to meet the challenge of poverty and how international law can be developed into a law of cooperation in this new field." Unquote. Subsequently, touching upon the third strand, that is Professor Anand's contribution to the International Court of Justice, this is yet another theme of his writings on international adjudication and the International Court of Justice. Professor Anand found great merit in the judicial settlement of international disputes. To him, this was the more civilized way to resolve disputes if other peaceful methods do not yield any result. Much like the individuals going to the court for redressal of their grievances within the domestic arena. Percy Corbett, a professor of law and jurisprudence at Yale and Stanford universities, in his foreword to Professor R.P. Anand's book on compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, 1958, writes, I quote, "If he is an enthusiast for judicial settlement as an essential function of an international community, his enthusiasm is disciplined by careful exploration of the facts and mature judgment of their meaning and portent. He is not overawed by authority, and his independent criticism spares neither person nor institution. But again, the characteristic quality of his work is balance." Unquote. Here again, Professor R.P. Anand champions the need of the developing states. He gave a skeptical impression over the court's role when, in the Southwest Africa cases, the ICJ, or the International Court of Justice, declined to go into the merits of the case. In his view, the decision was a hard blow to the confidence of the Asian and African states in the court. According to him, that confidence, especially of the African states, was regained only through the Nicaragua judgment of 27 June 1986. Feeling satisfied with the overall changing international trend in increasing judicial activity and proliferation of international tribunals, Professor Anand, citing from his earlier work on compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ, observes, I quote, that the states seem to be appreciating more and more the dictum of the PCIJ, which stands for the Permanent Court of International Justice, that judicial settlement of international disputes with a view to which the court has been established is simply an alternative to the direct and friendly settlement of such disputes between the parties. Professor Anand was not merely an international lawyer. Being well versed in the learning and arts of the world, he paved way for unified stand among developed and developing countries, for the need to have institutions and procedures for settlement of disputes as one of the basic functions of any civilized legal system. According to him, I quote, each day of peace is a time for extension of law, and every extension of law is a reinforcement of peace, unquote, as pointed out by him in a seminal article on enhancing acceptability of compulsory procedures of the international dispute settlement, published in the Max Planck Yearbook of United Nations Law. Besides these achievements, Professor Anand was a highly successful and a thoughtful teacher. It was a treat to listen to him and was often referred to as a master storyteller. He contributed immensely to the development of the Center for International Legal Studies, as it is called now, in the JNU, and his contributions to the Indian Society of International Law, they are no less significant, and provided these institutions with sustained leadership till he breathed last in 2011. Professor Anand's was a huge contribution in putting the Indian Society of International Law on the world map of national societies of international law. He inspired, for over 4 decades, the publication of the Indian Journal of International Law as a journal to promote India's and developing countries' views on international law. Through his works, Professor Anand commanded respect and admiration of Asian and Western international lawyers, scholars, and practitioners. In 2011, when he passed away, the messages on his demise testifies Professor Anand's unique standing and prominence, and I'm going to share a couple of those reflections. Dr. Rosalind Higgins, the former president of the International Court of Justice Rights, he has been an outstanding figure over the years in India and also in the world beyond. He has done so very much of being an understanding and developing an understanding of international law to a very wide community, and his work has been of an exceptional caliber, unquote. On this occasion, and in a touching tribute, Professor Upendra Bakshi observed, I quote, Ram was a quintessential teacher, secure in his belief that international law must remain accessible for international grasp by all. He spoke and wrote in a simple style that resisted the lure of Yale Law School, especially the great gharana of Myris McDougall and Harold Laswell. Knowing fully well that international law is a mighty arena of power, politics, and policy, Ram believed in the relative autonomy of the discipline. Doctrinal study or exploration remained thus for him a primary task of pedagogy and scholarship. In so doing, he displayed a virtuoso resistance to reductionist practices of teaching and researching the expanding spheres of international law as a mere handmaiden of power politics. Despite the subsidiary role accorded by the statute of the International Court of Justice to publicists as a source of international law, Professor Anand remained committed to the view that juristic expositions and enunciations play a co-equal role in shaping and at times even determining its future itineraries. And he nurtured this perspective further by his remarkable inaugural as well as sustained association with the Indian Society of International Law and the Afro-Asian Legal Consultative Committee, amidst others, for and calls for a posthumous festschrift in his honor, unquote. Professor Anand will go down in history as a great and inspiring international lawyer. At a ripe age, he was working on a manuscript on Africa and international law. Alas, that was unfinished, but an opportunity for all of us to contribute to the literature and fill the void. On this occasion, we are honored to have with us Professor Bharat Desai. He is a well-known international environmental lawyer from India. He has written extensively in the fields of international law, international environmental law, international environmental institutions and environmental law in South Asia and India. His most recent and important contribution on envisioning our environmental future was released on the special occasion of 50 years of the Stockholm Conference. The work examined, I quote, environmental regulatory approaches and institutional effectiveness and explores cutting edge ideational solutions for our shared triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. I join my colleagues in welcoming Professor Desai, my teacher, to deliver the lecture. Thank you so much for your indulgence.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik, for a very detailed insight. Before I request Dr. Desai to address the gathering, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce him. He has extensively worked on international law, and some of his notable books include Regulating Global Climate Change from Common Concern to Planetary Concern, Soil and Law Governance in India, Envisioning Environmental Future, Stockholm Plus 50 and Beyond, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in International Law, Making International Institutions Work. This also has a German language edition. Our Earth Matters, Pathways to a Better Common Environmental Future, International Environmental Governance towards UNEPO, Multilateral Environmental Agreements, Legal Status of the Secretariats, Creeping Institutionalization, Multilateral Environmental Agreements and Human Security, and Institutionalizing International Environmental Law. Professor Desai has been consulted by Union Ministries of Environment and Forests, as well as the Ministry of External Affairs, and inducted as a member of the official Indian delegations to various intergovernmental negotiations. Professor Desai initiated and coordinated four-partner JNU, Jammu, Kashmir, and Sikkim Inter-University Consortium on Himalayan Cryosphere from 2012 to 2020. I'd like to request now the guest of honor, Professor Dr. Bharat Desai, to address the gathering on the theme, The Era of a Planetary Crisis, Making International Law Work. So please.
नीचे करना है तो ये वाला ये अच्छा ये वाला और ये बैंक ये सही है और हाईलाइट करना है कुछ लाइट रेड लाइट नहीं होता सर अच्छा इसमें नहीं है हाँ ठीक है इज इट फाइन ऑन ही सर ये वायरलेस हाँ ठीक है बस या well good afternoon to everyone. It's indeed a pleasure and privilege for me to be here on this beautiful Jindal University campus. I'm really thankful to my esteemed friend and colleague Rajkumar. I hold him in high esteem. I know him for many years since his Hong Kong days, and Raj has consistently maintained his the value he attaches to scholars and scholarship. And also it's a special occasion for the simple reason that I've been invited. I've been honored to give this memorial lecture in honor of my own late teacher, Professor Ram Prakash Anand. And I also thank both my illustrious students, Sridhar, who is the registrar of this university, and Srijit, who is the executive dean of the Jindal Global Law School. I know I have been told that the audience has the reasonably good background of international law. So before I start, I thought I'll little share maybe for 2 to 3 minutes, because I have a thought that I'll have a good canvas. I'll try to cover little good amount of terrain mapping, But before that, let me share, because my own, as both Sridhar and Srijit both have pointed out, the close association. I literally grew with Professor Anand. I came when I was just 22, 23. I had almost a quarter century of association with him. And you can see, your own teacher growing with you, for instance, and you saw him from close quarters. My association with him was little different than my other esteemed colleagues. Professor Yogesh Tyagi and Professor B.S. Chimney, because I was the youngest one. So I had both the advantages as well as disadvantages, and because he liked me, I was, we had some similarities because, his name was, Ram. My name has been Bharat. So, in his family also, Mrs. Anand always used to say, Ramji ka Bharat aa gaya, and we also shared the same day as common birthday. 15th of June, has been our birthday. So we used to often celebrate, whether in Delhi or maybe, in Heidelberg, Max Planck Institute, where Mrs. Anand will, cook special meal and saying, both the birthday boys, will be invited to have that lunch or dinner on that occasion. So I've had huge amount of that thing. I have observed him. I thought, a teacher could have a different, facets of his personality. Different people can try to find different things from him. My perspective was little different. I did not speak Punjabi because people with Punjabi, language could have tried to have access to him. With my Gujarati background, but he really loved me. And I saw him, and I wanted to observe his experience. I didn't want to see the big names being dropped, big theories and schools of thought. I was not interested in those things. I wanted to see precisely as to how a good scholar can be a good human being, What is his kind of a passion for that particular discipline? How he writes, how he communicates, how he plays with the words, how he speaks, how he writes, That is what I observe over a period of years, Because I was always with him, in taking his, those classes, the tutorials, checking things, And I learned it firsthand. In fact, with Gujarati background, I came to Delhi and I had to hone my skills I didn't want to lag behind. I didn't want to have an English which will not pass the muster, in my university. So I sat and in UPSC language, they said, crack that English. Okay. And so Professor Anand had the full trust, In fact, one of the book which I brought, salient documents in international law. This entire book, he didn't know what was there, Found the documents in the pre photocopier days, got it typed, sitting with a typist in Saket 450-page book, that still remains there. It could have been I could have been a joint author, but for me that was not much at that. I learned it on job, that how do you do it? What matters? How do you draft the chapters? How do you, apportion the subjects? And much more important was his Hague lectures, 1986, the sovereign equality of states, that no one else had the benefit or the privilege, of checking the, proofs of the Hague lectures, After just finishing my MPhil, sitting in a hostel, I checked the proofs of the sovereign equality of states, And that was a first-hand learning, He taught me as to how do you do corrections, markings, deletions, additions, those. And so that perfection which you gain, that stays with you. What others cannot see, you can see. That is remarkable. That could be reflected in all your writings, the teaching and everything, because these are all interconnected. Okay, things don't remain in isolation. For me, for instance, when I came from Gujarat, for me, coming here was something a very big deal. No one will come there, because mostly that kind of a scholarship was something very alien, with my background. But when I came, I did not come, just to do my PhD. Okay. And once I entered the faculty, for me it was not a job per se. It became a passion. And I saw how, I had a long conversation with Professor Anand, on long drive to Faridabad, Connaught Place. He used to drive very fast. And like that, I imbibed that, although he had a huge car. And from a backside, if you see, you won't be able to see the driver. Because he was very, almost, he was this size, And always I used to accompany, and Mrs. Anand will always encourage, take Bharat with you. I was almost like, will escort him. And we used to share his knowledge, all these anecdotes and those experiences. That is the first hand thing which you know. I try to imbibe, not saying that, where do I park things or getting those things. And in that thing, obviously, he thought that, well, this boy will go away. So I could not go. Almost for a decade or so after my PhD, I could not go out, for my postdoctoral research, for instance, because he liked and he literally, I could do a lot of those teaching and research, etc. But and also he really loved and took interest in a lot of things. When I stayed in one single room, he used to come to my room also. When I stayed in two rooms, again he used to come. So he was very down to earth. He didn't have any those kinds of trappings, of being a big scholar, etc., etc. And that was the most important thing. So for a scholar, what I learned was ought to have humility, a down to earth kind of a wisdom, and that comes out, that gets reflected. Like they say, like there is a couplet which I was told by from Jalaluddin Rumi, that things coming from the heart, they straight goes to the heart. When you write from that kind of a thing, that matter. And when you, like, both my, Sridhar and Srijit have said, Professor Anand was a great storyteller. Although he will keep his note there, he'll read out from there, but the way in which the same thing we heard from him 100 times. But each time when you listen to him, it looks something different. Very interesting, he'll crack jokes, he'll tell those stories about the different international lawyers, the institutions, the places, the processes. That was very, very, very important, And that is exactly what is important when you walk into the classroom, How do you motivate your students, When I started doing for almost last 10 to 15 years, taking international law seriously. Because that is exactly the infallible kind of faith in the system of international law. Notwithstanding those negativities and things, saying that international law does not work, United Nations does not work, So what I do in my classroom, this is exactly what I learned from Professor Anand, When I walked into my MA classroom, I have about more than 100 students, with first PowerPoint which I show is international law at work. Like somebody who is on a contractual job is doing the work. And I show through the pictures, that where do you find international law, how it works, amorphously. It's almost invisible. Breaches of international law, you notice much more. That is, the entire system works, without which you can imagine the consequences. And that is exactly why, as an international law center or program, we were put as a part of the School of International Studies. International law provides that kind of a spinal cord for conduct of international relations and international affairs. So we have plenty of other things to share, but I think the time will not permit me. So let me also mention that my choosing or coming into this vocation, this especially the subject of my PhD thesis, on environmental field, the credit goes to Professor Anand, because initially I did my MPhil, under my again a very, very great scholar, H.P. Rajan, most of the people have forgotten him because he went to the United Nations subsequently. It was on the legal aspects of Palestine question. And one day he called me and explained to me, he's saying, you can't make a career. If you want, enter this area. And so I literally abandoned. My book was to be published by Krumhelm. Jordan's Crown Prince was to write a foreword to the book. I simply put a lead on it and entered this area. And then again I started writing to different national newspapers, etc., etc. We had one conference where Professor Anand again at IIC, chaired that session and came out with a book called Law, Science and Environment. For the first time, that big volume came out, So, and also because I was inspired by one of his earlier article, which probably had not been mentioned, is Development and Environment, a case of the developing countries. He wrote in 1980, Indian Journal of International Law. And again, when it came out, what was the prognosis? I'll just mention that, in terms of what was his suggestions or prognosis about the state of the environmental crisis after almost, you can say, 43 years or so. Situation by and large remains the same, or even it has almost become much, much worse, So let me little take you through some of these slides, as to how these things, matter. And I'll just mention about both the background of the title, the planetary crisis, which because that pertains to some of my own engagement in last couple of years, as to the kind of the global discourse which is there, and how my engagement, the scholarly engagement, has been so rewarding and so fascinating. Now this is the 1980 article where Professor Anand said, look at these three paragraphs which I picked up, and you could see that earlier period, where still the word gender neutral word was not used. It called still word man was used. So it says blindness of man to the causes of his own downfall has been persistently repeated all through history. But with the scope of the present crisis and the technology of warfare today, it is more than likely that if a serious downfall comes now, it will imperil the entire world, not just a civilization. No one nation or even group of nations can, acting separately, avoid the tragedy of increasing divisions between the wealthy north and the poverty-stricken south of our planet. No nation on its own can offset the risk of deepening disorder. Man must learn to live with nature rather than trying to conquer it. Unless he does so, and unless he controls his activities and stops destroying some of the life-supporting elements in nature, the planetary ecosystem will expel or destroy man as a noxious intruder who upsets the ever-changing but always harmonious web of life. This was his early prognosis, And you need to note this phrase which he used the word developing countries. Rarely, I have never seen Professor Anand using the word third world. That was not the nomenclature which was popular. I never used in my entire career, never ever any of the publication. Professor Khan also never used. I think he also never liked that. Professor Anand always used to prefer the developing countries versus developed countries. That was his basic premise. International law in developing countries. That was his main forte and the thrust. Now, being guided by that initial enthusiasm. This was one of my first, as I call it, the act of origin. 1986, in a Canadian journal, International Perspectives. This journal has ceased to be published. It was published by the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As an MPhil student, this was an article which was, I remember the then editor Gordon Cullingham. Thanks to him, this was my first published article. Very small article, but very pithy. And it says, another North-South issue. Another North-South issue. This was how I started, with my forays into the field of environment, And then I thought I'll bring you closer to the date, what I call the trilogy, the 2010-4 to 2014. These three titles, they're all three interconnected, Published by one transnational publisher, second the Brill Nayhoff, and the third by Cambridge University Press. So some of the groundwork which I had laid, that actually became my strength when I wanted to march deeper into this entire thing, rather than merely singing paeans about the process and what I observe not only through my studies, etc., but also being part of the official Indian delegation. I saw it from the close quarters, as to how the nations behave, what things matter, how the lobbying and how the civil society groups, what are the strengths and weaknesses of that what is called the lawmaking process, what goes into it and what does not go into it, how the posturings and playing to the gallery, for instance. That is exactly because the sovereign states behave exactly how the human beings behave, and human beings are not infallible. So any structure or process which the sovereign states, human beings design, it cannot be flawless. It has to carry the same infirmity which the human beings carry. So they are all human designed structures and processes about which we are trying to really grapple with and trying to see that they can be really reform and change, so that for some kind of a better future for the human beings. Now let me come to this four main parts where I'll try to first little elaborate before you the kind of the nature of the planetary crisis which is unfolding, why it has taken that planetary kind of a proportion. And I'm mentioning to you because right from the 1972, I brought this small monograph. Probably many of you might have seen, your teachers might have shown to you, called the Club of Rome report. It's a very fragile condition. It's more than 50 years old, and this was exactly I got it from Professor Anand. The limits to growth, the Club of Rome report. This is available on website if you write 1972 Club of Rome report. And this was the time when the original genesis of this was basically the a group of those concerned people, through a MIT project, came out with the findings. It's a 200-page report which try to you know uh, go into the whole issue of what is called the world problematic. Even in 1972, they could foresee there was something abnormally wrong. And when the Stockholm Conference took place, if you can see like when, India's late Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, she was the cynosure of all eyes, The late Olof Palme from Sweden, he was the host country Prime Minister, and Indira Gandhi went all the way from here. She represented the developing countries, aspirations of the developing countries. And when she spoke about that part, how can I ask my people not to pollute when their lives are contaminated at the source? For you, the industrialized countries, it's a matter of luxury. For us, it's a question of survival. And she became really I think the Miss Indira Gandhi's, those speeches are available, in Stockholm Conference. She was very charged. She was a lover of nature. And I reached out to the last surviving member of the former delegation, India's delegation to Stockholm Conference, Maharaja Dr. Karan Singh. He was chancellor of my university, and only last year he wrote a beautiful piece for me, looking through Indira Gandhi's vision. That what was the whole genesis and the thrust, and how Indira Gandhi led the Indian delegation with 4 cabinet ministers to the Stockholm Conference, and how almost, Delhi would have become the headquarters of the United Nations Environment Program. And India decided to give it in favor of the African solidarity. That is why it's located in Nairobi, in Africa, in Kenya. And how the whole situation gradually became little difficult. Now let me, before that I, mention about those other aspects, I thought I'll bring to your attention, this will be very important, because you need to see the context in which you are talking about, this entire legalese which you are talking about, that what is the world in which we live in. I've written these things, these are available from about 30 blog articles I have written, 30 articles in School of International Studies blog. If you can access the blog, all these articles are available, or I can provide the complete list. I've called out from some of my blog articles. Look at some of the, I've not covered everything, because everything I can't cover, and just few of them. Just to give you little flavor, little feeling about the kind of the situation in which we live in. Like they say, most world's water towers are really in jeopardy. Most of the glaciers, because of the global warming effect, etc., they are melting. Actually, as I said, I was the coordinator of this inter-university consortium on Himalayan cryosphere. I was the coordinator, Jammu, JNU, Kashmir and Sikkim University, and we could see how some of the benchmark glaciers are receding, retreating, depleting, and the water flows are. So in the years to come, this is one of the indicative of some of the crises which might be at work. Like the UN Secretary General said, in March 2023, that the human activity is driving our planet's temperature to dangerous new heights, turning glaciers into a canary in the coal mine. Losing these giants would be a giant problem for our world, And there is a big humanitarian crisis at work. If you look around, it is a spine chilling. Country after country is falling apart. There are issues, Of course, there are countries where there are coup d'etat, military takeover. Africa, there are countries where there are basket cases. The huge mass of the humanity. What will you do? How will you measure up? How will you sustain those people? Those hungry people, even their basic survival necessities are not there. It's one of the biggest challenge that you face. For instance, they say 1 in 23 people on our planet Earth, needs help in order to survive. 1 out of 23 persons. And almost 339 million people, they need humanitarian assistance. It's a staggering figure. They had a meeting last year, somewhere in Gulf, and United Nations humanitarian coordinator, Martin Griffith put an estimate that immediate assistance that you require, the funding that you need to generate is something like $50 billion, just to meet the basic needs, ranging from Afghanistan to Haiti to Syria to Sudan to Iraq to Democratic Republic of Congo. Name it, and this country after country are in a crisis. There are conflicts going on, for instance. There are extreme climatic events. Now the WMO's State of the Global Environment Climate Report, shows that planetary scale changes on land, in the ocean and atmosphere caused by the record levels of heat-trapping GHGs. And the last 8 years, 2015 to 2022, were the warmest on record. In fact, the extreme climatic events alone drove an estimated 16 million people into the food crisis in 15 countries. It also caused an exacerbated violence against women and children. During the pandemic, this reached the peak, and it is likely to reach 100 million people as the extreme climatic events grow, And the question is, how will you are talking about the climate-induced refugees, violence. These are the after effects of many of those issues which you'll need to be worried about. There is exacerbated poverty. There is sustainable development goals. I think today is 14, just 3 days down the road, on 18th of September, 18th and 19th of September, United Nations General Assembly President will be hosting a summit on the sustainable development goals. One of the cardinal principles, one of the 17 goals is, elimination of poverty. And you can see the poverty figures. The report which has just been released, it shows in 2022 report says 1.2 billion people in 111 countries living in acute multi-dimensional poverty. Largest number of poor people live in sub-Saharan Africa, 579 million people, and South Asia, 385 million people. There is a huge amount of violence against women. We have done that big book, exclusive book on it. It has really, gone, there are, in last 8 months, this book has seen something like 1,538 downloads. 1,538 downloads. And increasing number of, that shows, and if you, I don't know whether you had the chance to see the video of the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize, by Nadia Murad, receiving the prize, and Denis Mukwege, the DRC, Congolese gynecologist, And I will suggest you that please look at that. So one of the central theme of that 2018 Nobel Peace Prize is the violence, and especially what is called the sexual violence in conflict and rape under orders, not rape by accident, rape under orders. Rape as an instrument of warfare, and people go scot-free, country after country, situation after situation. More than 2 billion people live in conflict zones. 1/4 of the global population lives in conflict zones. And you need to know the meaning of living in conflict zones, So you have the huge amount, and we did, along with one of my postdoctoral fellows, Momita Mandal, we did find out the figure in 2021 in European Union alone. The cost of the sexual and gender-based violence was estimated around 366 billion euro per year, out of which violence against women constitutes 79%, 289 billion euro. So there is a staggering cost. Increasing number of countries are worried because this is deeply embedded. It's part of the structures and processes, There are half a dozen special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Committee, which are actually dealing with this entire issue. There is a United Nations Secretary General special representative on sexual violence, Pamela Patton, a Mauritius diplomat. She is the special representative. So you have one of the biggest challenge there. During this particular period, the nuclear weapons have grown. At the start of 2022, 9 nuclear weapon armed countries, USA, Russia, UK, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, have total inventory of an estimated 12,705 warheads, out of which about 9,440 were in military stockpiles for potential use, ready to use. 9,440 nuclear weapons, ready to be used, to destroy. And I'm sure, I think the recent days when this movie was released in the Indian theaters, the Oppenheimer, it took us back to that period. You saw how the person who is the main inventor, the kind of the trauma through which he, as I have written a blog article on this, the Oppenheimer moment, And when Oppenheimer himself remembered those words of Lord Krishna, saying that, I am the death, I am the destroyer of the world. What he refers to is the time. And that could be graphic. One single case, and you have thousands of, just by accident, anything can go wrong. And you could see, I again suggest, if you want to see what it means, is please listen to Barack Obama's, video at Hiroshima bomb site. He said, on that fateful day, the death rained from the sky, and the souls of the departed speak to us. Look at the spine-chilling thing. Immediately, thousands of people perished with one single, and not once, twice they were used. And you saw how a politician, very tersely tells the inventor of the nuclear weapon, the person who did everything. And that is a very, very ominous message to the scientists and the researchers, If the politicians hijack the whole thing, what could be your plight? Look at and Oppenheimer suffered trauma. His security license was cancelled. Jawaharlal Nehru he invited him to come to India. He was not allowed to come. He was not allowed to come. Only last year, American president revoked his cancellation of the security. Look at how the governments they do. And like Harry Truman bluntly tells Oppenheimer, saying that you said that you invented the nuclear weapon, but I used it. So people know me. No one knows you. How much it could be painful or traumatic for a who spent precious years of his life in doing an invention. And that is exactly why I wrote another piece on this taming the beast, artificial intelligence, that those graphic words will come true. How will you do it? Once the genie is out of bottle, once it is invented. And it can be very spine chilling. I was there just few weeks ago in one of the Chinese cities where I had to deliver the lectures, in a 5-star hotel. When I walked into the lift, the co-passenger with me in the lift was a robot. He'll just smartly will come with you, walk into the lift, turn around and just wait for a particular floor where the robot will get down. No emotions, nothing. So that is exactly the difference between a human being and a robot. And if, imagine a situation when you have many of the people who sitting in the audience in a 10 or 20 years down the line, in Jindal Global Law School would be robots. Imagine a situation, how frightening it could be for us. So we need to have the guardrails. We need to have those things. These are some of the potential challenges. And lastly, the people living in the conflict zone. 60% of the world's population, living, undernourished, in the conflict zones. Now, let me come. I think the credit goes to the Secretary General of United Nations, and he is one of the very frisky politicians, the former Prime Minister of Portugal, with that stature. The person, he speaks bluntly, speaks truth. When he came to New Delhi, he spoke very bluntly. I think somebody did ask him the question that don't you think this is the failure of United Nations, about a particular. He said, you keep fighting, and why do you put blame to United Nations? You ought to stop the fighting. United Nations can't catch hold of you because you want to fight. Very simple. So the same Secretary General went on 2nd of June, I organized a webinar on this issue, and he told the Stockholm audience, Earth's natural systems cannot cope up with the demands, We are consuming at the rate of 1.7 planets a year. 1.7 planets a year. Current global population is 8 billion. By year 2050, it is likely to reach to 10 billion. The space will remain the same. Amount of consumption of resources, the wastage, the pollution, everything is piling up. Look at the things that you have created. Your life is going to be much more miserable. You imagine the plight of the future generations, What will they inherit? What will they inherit, Because irrespective of what you do, and I recall the prophetic words of the former late Prime Minister of India, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, in a very, poetic Hindi, he said that, कि इंसान चांद पर तो पहुंच गया है, but उसको धरती पर मनुष्य बन के रहना नहीं आया. Live like a human being, to live on this planet Earth, You had the excellent things here, and you spoiled it. Now you are looking for the space elsewhere, This is going to be almost unthinkable, in the years to come, You can't burn your own house. You can't burn your own house. And that is exactly what the Secretary General went on saying. And he said, global well-being is jeopardy. It needs an urgent, all-out effort to turn things around. And 3 important aspects which need to be noted. One is the climate emergency. There is killing and displacing ever more million lives a year. If somebody says there is no cost, here is the cost. 9 million people. And this is still an underestimate. Large number of the cancers and lot of other things which are happening to people is largely because of the lives which you live. Indoor pollution, outdoor pollution, how much your body receives the toxics, the food that you eat, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, how much you have made your life miserable. Is it really worth it? Is it really worth living that life, And this entire Stockholm, that gathering where the Secretary General is standing with the 2 co-hosts, the Swedish Prime Minister and the Kenyan host, and the Secretary General and the President of the UN General Assembly. That it confronts an array of complex challenges: escalating conflicts, worsening climate chaos, entrenched poverty and hunger, widening inequalities, deepening mistrust and division. So here are the problematic in which you are trying to address a lot of those things. What people or the scholars of Professor Anand's generation used to address was the whole issues revolving around the, independence of the state, coming out of the colonial yoke, those kind of racism, apartheid, those kinds of issues. Now the things have reached to a different level when some of the deeply entrenched, these like that poverty refuses to go away, inequality, huge amount of hatred and the kind of the, for instance, kind of the intolerance that prevails, racial discrimination. United Nations General Assembly year after year passes resolution after resolution condemning and giving a call to the countries to put their own house, because United Nations cannot do any. This is actually has to be done at the domestic level. How you behave, how you treat your own people, and minimize the chances so that you don't create the global problems, because United Nations will not have the wherewithal to address many of these challenges, And here there are increasing number of scientific reports which are again drawing a very gloom picture. IPCC's sixth assessment report says the net anthropogenic GHG emissions have increased since 2010 across all major sectors globally, as have cumulative net CO2 emissions since 1850. UNEP's emissions gap report, October 27, 2022, again reinforced the global concern that the international community is falling far short of the Paris goals with no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius in place. WMO's report says has predicted that during the period 2013 to 2022, sea level rise has been 4.5 millimeter a year, wherein the human influence is construed as the main driver of such ominous sea level rise. Sea level is rising. So in that case, large number of the low-lying areas, the island countries are likely to be submerged. It is happening. You can see the ferocity which, the sea waves they strike in many of these countries. And this is one of the biggest challenges. Once it strikes, once it happens, you simply cannot do anything, Extreme weather event. Look at the cost which has been predicted. On 22nd May 2023, the WMO has again predicted, that extreme weather caused 2 million deaths. 2 million deaths, cost $4 trillion over last 50 years. According to WMO, weather, climate and water related hazards caused close to 12,000 disasters between 1970 and 2021. Developing countries were hit the hardest, with 9 in 10 deaths, 60% of the economic losses from climate shocks and extreme weather events. This is exactly what I did when I was a student, I wrote an article called Managing Ecological Upheavals, where it showed that bulk of the things, although the disaster events could be much more in the developed countries, large number of the death and large number of the harm takes place in the developing countries, because you don't have the coping mechanism. You saw it here right next door. Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, Punjab, you are completely submerged. District after district is in water. Bangladesh, for instance, bulk of the things. Every year, Bangladesh, is going to be under deluge, You have not found a large harm. Your economy gets huge amount of loss. People die. Infrastructure gets damaged, How would you? So you need to find the ways, in which these losses could be minimized. Human lives lost, they are precious resource of your country. Your environment, your natural resources, your land becomes almost which cannot be used for agriculture or any other purpose, for instance, Infrastructure gets damaged, power lines get destroyed, bridges, you saw it, roads, highways, all those things which big ticket projects, they get destroyed, And you say there is no cost. It's a staggering cost. Staggering cost. You saw the highways simply caving in. Mountains coming down. There are long-term consequences and reasons for it. Now let me come to briefly touch upon, because here in this entire, what I call as the conductor of a giant orchestra, is the key role which is being played by the plenary organ of United Nations, the General Assembly. Not many scholars give much credence to General Assembly. They talk with derision. Many of the hardcore international lawyers never done. But for me, personally, I think I would consider this is the only democratic organ in the United Nations. This is the only democratic organ. Like on 5th of September, the 78th session of the General Assembly has commenced. All roads lead to New York. And there is a big lineup. On 26th of September, Indian External Affairs Minister is slated to speak. There is a long list, Everybody wants to be there on that podium of the General Assembly, You don't want to miss that chance, That shows the significance. Every year the General Assembly adopts more than 300 resolutions. Large number of those issues on it does, Who else will do that stock taking? Who else will address them? Although the legal character of the resolutions, has been a matter of debate, But there are resolutions and resolutions, It depends, like when you say the glass is half full or half empty. It all depends. The beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. If you consider that to be, how much strength it has, for instance, if your vision is blinkered, you will not take that, because you have no other place to go. This is the only forum which can really assemble the people, and that is exactly what is being done. On 18th and 19th of September, the General Assembly President convened the summit of the summit on sustainable development goal. 1 year after that, next year, 22nd of September, again another summit will take place. Summit of the future. Well, all heads of state, heads of government will be invited. There is also a big grouping call on future generations. So there is already a thought and a process has started to think about what will be the fate and the plight of the future generations. You ought to think about it. The present generation owes that duty to the future generations, for instance. So I will not, these are the series of events I have listed as to what just within next 2 weeks the General Assembly is supposed to do. Series of those high level events which the General Assembly will host. People go there, have the deliberations. This is the best way to do that. Because the United Nations was created to create us that structure, provide a platform, institutionalized form of cooperation, not confrontation. And that is exactly what the General Assembly does. It provides you a platform. You go there, you make it a point. Everybody, wants to be seen there in the General Assembly, for instance, And you want your countries, names to be displayed, amount of time which is given to you, the hierarchy or whatever. Series of those things, the sheer recognition will really matter. And the very fact that you have the chance, to discuss series of those events and the processes, And General Assembly resolutions as one of the constituent instrument. And the classical example is the creation of the United Nations Environment Programme. There is no treaty. It's merely through a resolution adopted by the General Assembly on 15th of December 1972. Resolution 2997, of the General Assembly. So this has become a constituent instrument. This entire international, because United Nations Environment Programme lacks that characters, trappings of a formal international organization. I've done a good amount of work on that UNEP as an entity, but notwithstanding that, it works, as what is called international environmental institution, And here is a resolution which acts as one of the, so this is one of the important contribution, 1972 Stockholm Conference. And the General Assembly President, as I said, has convened the summit of the Sustainable Development Goals on 18th and 19th of, again, as I said, I have written a blog article on 12th of August in SIS blog, the rescue plan for 2030 SDGs, audacity of hope, for people and the planet. This should be available, which provides the entire enlisting of the process which is at work, the risk which you have, and the immediate course correction that is required for if you want to really see that the things do not. It's a midway between 2015 and 2030. 7 years are yet left, and they say only 12% of the sustainable development goals have been complied. Just 12% after 7 years, and most of the others. Either you are lagging behind or there is a regression. There is a negative development, So by year 2030, when you wanted elimination of poverty, remove hunger, malnutrition, gender issue, all those parameters, 17 sustainable development goals with 169 targets, they are nowhere to be, around to be complied. And as I said, the large part of the reason will be because of the world in which we live in. The conditions are such, where day after day, like you can see the cyclones and earthquakes taking place, completely destroying things, and warfare. Half a dozen countries where the military has taken over power. And United Nations keeps pleading to them. The president is imprisoned, the military takes over power, resources are gone, people are put behind the bar. Country like Iran, Afghanistan, where women have been completely put behind, a curtain. No education. You can't even work anywhere. And you watch with horror. United Nations keeps pleading. The entity which has not been recognized. That shows the limits of it. What can, when country after country, those powerful countries, you saw how United States, the mighty United States, the army simply withdrew, vanished. In the Kabul airport, you saw the kind of the, how the, literally the people were trying to find a place to just to leave the country, for instance, After 20 years or occupation or so, the country is completely in mess. A renegade element, an international pariah, is now holding the power. And you can't do anything about it. This is one of the biggest challenge, And you saw the people are hungry. India herself provided some 30 million tons of wheat, to Afghan people, which again had to be, the Pakistanis created a problem because you don't have a direct land border. Look at it, how do you do? How do you do? Just to feed people so that they can survive. This is one of the biggest challenge, And many of the sustainable development goals, they are very utopian, done with very idealistic purpose, everything. But again, the kind of the ground reality is so worrisome. Then most of the goals are likely to remain on paper. And the goals are what? Basic necessities of life, so that you can at least live as a decent human being. And here, as I said, the two summit meetings which are being designed, the UN Deputy Secretary General, she was on the job. She was in Brasilia, had a meeting with the Brazilian government, and now this is just, as I said, the 4 day down the line is going to be the Secretary General is urging the leaders to come to the General Assembly, to contribute to a rescue plan. And one of the biggest issue which because of the paucity of time I will not be able to mention is the whole question of debt crisis. Large number of the countries, they are unable to pay their debt. You saw it, like Sri Lanka collapse. Bangladesh is still in a critical condition. Pakistan, almost economy is literally in a spin. Country after country is falling apart. And the question is, how do you do? Because the debt servicing itself is huge. India also has it, but India has a reasonably good war chest. We have the foreign exchange reserves which are very sufficiently taking care of those things, And that is exactly why these all international financial institutions were supposed to come here and provide a little window, And you saw, it's so deeply entrenched. There is nothing. The whole Secretary General has mooted the plan, what is called the debt stimulus, to revitalize, to change the thing, the schedule, No remission. Those billions of dollars, which, So the question is, how do the people, you take care of your things, Basic necessity of life, People were so spendthrift, they went on taking the loan, जैसे हमारे वहाँ होता है यहाँ country side में होता है ना, शाहूकार नहीं होता है तो कहता है वो आदमी ऋण में ही जन्म लेता है, ऋण में ही मर जाता है. That is exactly what is the plight of most of the developing countries. That you take the debt, and that debt remains continues over generation after generation, with even a simple. So this is one of the biggest, which puts a strain on your resources. Your developmental thing is on a very narrow thing, And this is one of the biggest challenges. You talk about it, the instruments, the processes, why they don't deliver, You don't have the resources, you don't have the margin, you don't have the maneuverability. How do you deliver? Except barring those few countries, and you saw this about a group of those 20 those countries, which got together here. They have 85% of the global GDP. Large number of the other countries still they are outside. Large mass of barring those 21 countries, for instance, And this is little the figure which I drew, covers all those 9 major steps through which the General Assembly, carried out the global environmental conferencing technique, through which, these processes have been going on and on and on, for instance, and they have been quite useful because often, they come out with declarations, results, the processes, yet not the ideal outcome is always visible, and yet you require these global conferences, But as I wrote one of the articles saying that, are there any limits to the global environmental conferencing technique, Are there limits to legalism? Are there any limits to legalism? And that is exactly the direction in which when we go into the future, I will just show you, that you need to do, because there you are exasperated. There is no escape hatch available there, So now I come to the final part, of my presentation, that when I say about the making international law work, that do ideas matter? Do ideas matter, And how do you walk the talk? Because people will say that, what do you do? Do you really walk the talk? Let me take you through this little walk, Here are the 3 outcomes which I got engaged during this last 2 years. It covers totally 55 contributions from outstanding scholars from around the world, every continent, and scholar after scholar provided those, and they have a connecting thread. 2023, 2022, 2021. This has just come out early this month. The print copy has just come. 12 contributions envisioning our environmental future. 22 scholars have contributed, and our Earth Matters during the pandemic period, 2020, 21 contributions, 55 scholarly contributions, and to each of them, through each of the processes, I sat and single-handedly edited and processed it. You can imagine the kind of the plight I did, how much it took my time, during the pandemic period, the overwork, including the 7 PhDs which I cleared. And you can imagine the number of pages, 14,000 pages, 14,000 pages, 6 to 7 drafts of each thesis. And obviously these books, And the net result was I had to go to all days to medical sciences to check my eyes. And the doctor told me that you don't need to do this kind of work, amount of work. No one does. I said, but I have no option but to do. No one else will do it. I have to sit and do it. And because I was motivated, as I said, for that larger global discourse. None of those established centers, you talk about Harvard and MIT and Stanford and those, none of these people, none of them, you can just check the websites. They have huge war chest, huge resources. None of them have shown any courage to engage in this kind of a discourse, single-handedly, So these are the ideas which are required, ideas where the constant question was solution-oriented. That what next? Not abstract, theoretical, mundane ideas, World has no time for it. That time is over. All those people who play to the gallery, those galaxies and, blame game, to make a career out of it, It's very easy to make career by blaming somebody. But what next? Do you have anything concrete to offer? And each of my contributors, really came around, in their own way, although within the limits of time, because I couldn't still push them beyond a point. Because I had to take whatever the scholarly, outcome was which are available to me. I could fine-tune the title, I could fine-tune the focus, fine-tune the outcome, etc., pushing them, like one of the scholar, Nicholas Robinson, saying that depleting time, rapidly depleting time. Edith Brown Weiss wrote a forward to this middle volume called Envisioning Our Environmental Future from Georgetown University, She has been talking about the, planetary trust. So a lot of these ideas are there, ranging from our Earth Matters, for instance, that ultimately these really, what will ultimately be essential for you, and who will crack it? Who will resolve some of these problems which I am mentioning? The kind of the background in which the world is saddled, the kind of the planetary level crisis which is there. You have the instruments. You have the maze of instrument. Huge number of these global conferences taking place, the global parlays are taking place, and yet you see each time the G20 issues the declarations, Bali had almost 50 to 53 paragraphs, New Delhi has 83 paragraphs. So there is no end to that. The question is, who will walk the talk? Brazil has taken over, I think 1st of December, next September or October they will have another summit. Within that 1 year, what dramatic development will take place? And so I think in that sense, it's a good thing that Indian Prime Minister really said that we still have 2 months to go, and we want to monitor. And it's a really good thing. You really need to ensure that the people walk the talk, what you promised. Each of those small things will really matter. Because most of the declarations are, you just celebrate it, the bureaucracy celebrates and saying, okay, we came out with the declaration. But then the question is, who will really read the fine print? Who will walk it? Only the educational institution will read the G20 declaration and celebrate. So walking the talk, implementing those things are very important. I've already mentioned about this. I will not have the time to go into the great details, but I thought just this, I'm sure your library will be having it. I'm sure they must have been acquired, And I sent I think I gave the hard copy to Raj also earlier, So the climate change, again, in a very, very, very precarious condition. You have the 3 instruments, and I wrote a preface called Climate Change Conundrum. It goes on and on and on. There is no one to bail the cat. Who will walk the talk? Who will reduce the emissions? You ask the others to do it. And most of the developing countries, they say now there is a backtracking. One Indian former ambassador, T.S. Tirumurti, who was India's permanent representative to the United Nations, wrote a beautiful article. He wrote an article in Hindu, and I invited him. And he said, I never wrote an article. So I helped him to write. I actually put his footnotes. Wrote an article called Backtracking on Climate Commitments, for instance. That all those things which are promised on the basis of which the developing countries entered the Paris Agreement, they are non-starter. Most of the developing countries are in the so there is a fatigue effect, there is a disappointment. How much, those voluntary commitments which the developing country, you go on promising, saying that by 2050 we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this, but the actual action on the ground is less. Moving away from fossil fuel is not happening. If you can see, country after country is still deeply mired into the fossil fuel game. You have to immediately stop it. They say the damage is already done. There is no point. You can't even go back. Even if you, they say in the the climatologists have been saying that even if you reduce the GHG emission by 60% immediately for a foreseeable future, till year 2100, for instance, the global climate or greenhouse gases emissions or the heating is going to continue, for instance. It's already done. It's already deposited, You have to stop it so that, the future does not become more grimmer, And how it will strike, for instance, how it will show its effect, The Stockholm Plus 50, as I said, the UN Secretary went there like his plight was that of a small little house sparrow. When her forest was on fire, she went on, pleading to the people to help, and try to douse the fire. This is exactly what the Secretary General keeps doing it, And all those big people, kept laughing and making fun of the person, And so here, I think at least he is the one who at least speaks, because there is otherwise in the UN hierarchy, if you see, UN, we have had the Secretary General who never spoke. They knew how to simply to smile. They never spoke. That was the criteria on which the UN Secretary Generals were chosen, actually, But here is a politically heavyweight person who actually pushes the things, for instance, And I hope we can see that how it happens. And another person is the, Inger Anderson, the executive director of, United Nations Environment. Again, she speaks her mind, trying to push a lot of those things, for instance, And I think again the question is, 50 years after the Stockholm Conference, things have become much worse. And I ask question. I have a webinar which is available on 5th of June 2022. If you want to see, those webinars are available on the website of my journal. Environmental policy and law. You log on to that. And I asked the question to the panelists. About dozen people who were on the panel. What went wrong? Who did it? How come it happened? What happened to all the resources, all the effort, all legalism which you did? All the global treaties, more than 300 agreements have been designed, more than 300 multilateral environmental agreements. Institutions have been created, spent trillions of dollars. What went wrong? It shows their sheer inability to understand nature's ways. You do not understand your environment. You do not understand what you are actually doing. You are actually putting too much pressure. And what Gandhi was right, your sheer greed, So you are almost back to square one, And our earth matters again, where a lot of these things which are there, that you wanted to have those effective responses, to meet some of these, what is called the human quest for development, as I said in one of my earlier articles, seriously threatens our fragile ecosystem. And plenty of those scholarly works, ranging from Silent Spring to, Richard Fox, Endangered Planet, to Barbara Ward and René Dubos, Only One Earth, these scholarly writing which are already sounded the alarm bells, And after 50 years, probably we are in the same place. And some of the proposals, again, I will not have time much to go into that, but then because you will ask me that what next? Because you need to, when you are doing something, a construction or job, you need to chisel your tools, whatever exists. You can't invent because there are limits. You can't have the brand new tools. If you want to acquire, they are not available. Funding is not available. So all that you do is to dig out something, all your conventional tools, try to fine tune and try to see whether they work or not, till probably somebody will have a better sense to have a new instrumentality to address the problematic, And as I said, for instance, there are 4 important areas in which I thought, the effort will need to be immediate, where least cost options are there. You need to put the instrumentalities on a firm footing, give them a proper mandate, resources, and make them work, because you on your own, nothing can happen. The question is not individual, it's not happening only one single country, it's a global, it's a planetary level kind of a crisis, which you need the instrumentality which will work at that particular level. And you must give the wherewithal, instruments, resources, and the human being, with those people who are passionate, dedicated, not the bureaucracy. You do not need global bureaucracy. It's a bureaucratic structure which have really destroyed things, United Nations is oversized, I think you can see that, many of those problems which have created. The domestic bureaucracies only eyes for the, UN positions. They park themselves, and most of the things remain status quo. Most of the decisions, you need the people who will deliver results, who will find solutions. You need people of those levels. So one is, of course, United Nations Environment Protection Organization. As I said, all that you need is a UN specialized agency. One of the final leg in which the UN Environment Program can be elevated. Also, you need revival and repurpose of the UN Trusteeship Council. And let me mention to you, because this will be of interest. Some of you might go into the area of doing a PhD research or something. And often the questions are asked that, do you really become bold enough to envisage something or foresee something in the future, come out with some bold proposals or not? When I read my things, this was the result of the first 2 ideas were mooted at the invited lecture at the legal department of the World Bank on 15th of January 1999. This was the time when when Professor Anand was in with his son on the outskirts of Washington DC. He came to receive me at the airport. It was a severe snowstorm on that day. And I remember even on that snowy day when the electric cables had fallen, there was darkness in the entire Washington area. Still, the World Bank had enough people to listen to me on 15th of January 1999. And some of the ideas which are mooted, a lot of scholars laughed at it. They say, and I remember, I don't want to give the name of the scholar, one of the very top global political scientists. He said, "You seem to be the only person left out in the field." I said, I'm not deterred by it, because mine is not I'm not parking myself to plant my article in the journal or location or to please somebody or to have a clique or a gang, which will really form a cartel to push each other. I am not in that game. I enjoy being lonely, because I know about the value of what I am doing. And you can imagine, after more than 20 years, count the years, in 2021, the UN Secretary General came out with a report called Our Common Agenda. And finally, he said, the Trusteeship Council needs to be revived and repurposed. Everybody wrote it off. It's now on the agenda. And I'm sure maybe next year, because here is the least cost option. Trusteeship Council is very much there. There is a hall there. All that you need to do is to change the rules of business, open the door, and it will be part of the United Nations formal. All that you need is find a way out. Because there in the charter, you need to change the mandate, purpose, etc., etc. Even I think 2 years ago, the Indian Prime Minister, in his address to the G20 summit, he said, trusteeship for the planet. He reached to that extent. And the question is, what next? Who will do it? Who will translate that trusteeship for the planet into action? You need an instrument, and you have the instrument. So it's bound to be there. In fact, I received a letter from the the President of the General Assembly, 73rd session, very long letter. Dear Professor, that was one of the finest, kind of a commendation you receive from the President of the UN General Assembly, and also the Secretary General of the United Nations, and at least 3 heads of government: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and also for Germany and Russian President Vladimir Putin's office. They said, you trusted us. Russian Federation said, you trusted us, and we'll take a call when the right time comes. So what I'm trying to mention is, some of these scholars, you write for the posterity. You don't want to convince or please somebody. And when the time comes, the idea, they never go waste. So I think, I'm sure, and some of the new pathways, I'll just quickly go through it. I'll just show you things. They're already available. Citations are given, so maybe please read them. It's a long, and there are many of those things already published. Articles are already there in my publications list. They should be available in your library. This is a structure which was proposed as a UN specialized agency. Now, what a specialized agency can be? I did this is just a sample list. There are 16 specialized agencies of United Nations, and you look at the instrument, mandate, structure, and functions. So when UNEP becomes a specialized agency, this is the only environmental issue. They are called the functional international organizations. You don't have a only environment is the only area where you don't have a specialized agency. And specialized agencies are those which are governed by a specialized agreement between the President of the Economic and Social Council and a particular head of a particular agency. So you have 16 of them, and gradually the UN Environment Program is inching closer to becoming a specialized entity. Now the membership of the UN EP has become universal. Funding again has been little put on a firmer footing. UNEP's governing council has been called Environmental Assembly. And the question is, what next? What next? Why do you feel shy? Why do you hesitate? So you need to give a push, final push. So structure, because there are reasons for it. Why I am saying is a hierarchy. Like the human beings also have the hierarchy, institutions also have the hierarchy. You suffer from the same vices. When the executive director of UNEP sits in the midst of those big sharks, the heads of the WMO and other organizations, they look with derision. They try to upgrade the designation of the UN executive director of UNEP, called Under Secretary General of United Nations, and yet it doesn't pass the muster. So ultimately you have to take a call, but there are other competitors, there are vested interests. So it will take time, and you need the people. You need location is also another important problem. As I said, at that time, 50 years ago, Nairobi was made to be and my question will be, can you really think about the location? Because Nairobi has a problem. Security problems are there. Location, because most of the staff members who live, they don't keep their families there in Nairobi. You need to talk to people. You go there and you have the strict instructions. For take a particular taxi, otherwise, you will be in risk. Can there be a international city where you have a UN agency with that work environment, So you have to take a look at it, There is nothing sacred. Obviously, there is African solidarity. African countries will rally around. But those things, you have to take a dispassionate look. Trusteeship Council, again, here is the things, I have a full article called The Repurpose UN Trusteeship Council for the Future in 2022 Environmental Policy and Law Report. Some of the specific articles which will require to be modified. I didn't want to leave it to chance, I didn't want to leave it to conjecture and to the bureaucrats. I said, if the trusteeship council is to be given a new mandate, what it can be. I rewrote the articles. Okay, whether you like it or not, it's a different matter. But let the posterity take a call, because this has to happen someday. You have to give a new mandate. Resources, and it's there, the trusteeship council hall, where the meetings periodically takes place, So why not you need an entity, and here is a time where you will need, the composition, other things can vary, and you have many of the things which are already taken under the United Nations without formal amendment of the Charter of United Nations, like the appointment of the Deputy Secretary General of United Nations. It's not there in the Charter. You have the observer system in the United Nations. The Charter of United Nations wedded to the sovereign states. Probably you might remember there are only two entities which are not states, which are very unique, Do you remember which are those entities? One is obviously Palestine, and second is the Vatican. They are called, non-member observer states. Non-member observer states. So you have those situations which are created. It was done by a beautiful report, prepared observer system by outstanding Belgian international lawyer Eric Sui, who was the UN Under Secretary General for United Nations, and legal counsel to United Nations Secretary General, who carve out a way. So, chance for innovation is always there. If you trust a proper mainstream, futuristic or outstanding international lawyer, not the consultants. Consultants can't do this job. Consultants, they will earn the money. Their reports are already stored in the computer for next 20 years. You can't depend upon the consultants. You need to rely upon, and if you can see the processes through which many of these tasks take place, And here are the things I just mentioned. I will not go into, so please read them, And finally, last part, the multilateral environmental agreements. They again need a lot of those things: clustering, location, interlinkages, because many of these secretariat, like the climate secretariat, the biodiversity secretariat, I have a full monograph on it. Multilateral environmental agreement published by Cambridge University Press. They don't talk to each other. Secretariats don't talk to each other. They're sitting in Nairobi, Montreal, Bonn, Geneva. They don't talk to each other. And the administrative agency also ill-treats them. So there are problems, about what is called the legal status of the secretariats. I went into huge that kind of, that is the only monograph of its kind available on the legal status of the secretariats. And you need to really know the animal. And you need to really tame the animal and try to see that they deliver result. They have tried some way, like on the chemicals and the hazardous waste cluster. 3 conventions have been put together. I'll mention that toward the end. And here are the regime-based institutions. Just to give you a little flavor, because you might have a question as to what kind of it. Here it is. And the new pathways. Here are some of the thoughts which are already being shown. For instance, on the Sustainable Development Goals, people have been talking about the people, planet, partnership, prosperity, each of them. But they always they revolve around these 17 goals. Like the poverty, knowledge systems, global solidarity, promoting, sustainable and safe societies. Those things again, they remain the hallmark. If you want to have entirely a new paradigm, because that touches to the ordinary lives. So when you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, you talk about the people and the planet. People are intrinsic part of it. You have to factor, and obviously the others also. And when you want to little do what is called reimagine something, then how do you reimagine the future? Those ideas have to be there. You have to have, what I'm saying, this is exactly where the scholarly task will be there, Or regeneration of the ecosystems for community and social service. Ecosystems, because there are essential ecological, processes. You can't touch them. A large number of those processes you need to identify. The scientists shall have to do it. The scholars shall have to really, push those processes. Mere high level, those highly centralized global structures, cannot resolve many of those. It has to be done somebody has to do the spade work. Somebody has to do this entire thing in a very, very, very sensible way, in a very, 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 very innovative way. Because these are the things where the damage has already been done. You did a very haphazard development. You wanted a kind of you confuse, growth with progress, for instance, Like Rabindranath Tagore had said, that we have been, chasing the Western chariot, deafened and blinded by the dust, You never thought that whether it suits you or not. Or like Mahatma Gandhi said, same thing. He said, you need to have something which is locally conducive, Your need and greed, You can take only that much which you require. And that is exactly the basic mantra which you shall have to hold on if you really want to make a crack. And education institutions shall have to play a decisive role. Once you say no to plastic, it's end of it. End of it. That is exactly how the change will come. Big processes, once you say, I don't want it, nothing doing. Like the children have done. Like when you remember when the scientific report came about the pesticide residue in some of those so-called soft drinks, for instance, It was splashed in the media, and immediately most of the children who were going to Delhi schools, they stopped taking soft drink. They forbade their parents also from taking the soft drinks, who were addicted to the soft drinks, It changed it. Soft drink sells completely nosedives. And it becomes so cheap. It was so dirt cheap, कहते एक bottle लो और दूसरी bottle साथ में ले जाओ gift में. You know it. There is nothing there, But there is so much addiction. So it leads to multiple problems. So you need to change your lifestyles. You need to change those processes. Because the health is also an integral part of it. Why should these super specialty hospitals, they grow? Your economy grows because they say your profit in this quarter is more than the profit in the last quarter. GDP grows. Is this the kind of the development that you want? Where the hospitals produce more and more. Hospitals earn more and more because more and more people fall sick. Cancer level, super specialty cancer hospitals are growing. Is that the path of development? Which society will like it? It's harmful. You can see the abnormal rise in those epidemic of cancers and many of those lifestyle diseases which have happened. So you have to do it. Governments have the limits though. We should not I think individuals, societies, families shall have to call. And so I think when you talk about the new regenerative pathways, resource use and other things, we shall have to really give a little more thought to it. Now some other thing I'll just flag. I will not go much into it. In terms of you know some of these new planetary level challenge, where again international law has a kind of a footprint. Those processes and structures, either they are non-existent or they are inadequate or deficient. They need to be reworked. You need to give a thought to it in a very innovative and remarkable way, so that these things can be really tightened up before the damage takes place. And I mentioned a couple of the example, like the artificial intelligence. I have written a full article, if you want, on this available on our blog, Taming the Beast, on the global regulation of artificial intelligence for a safe future. That how it can be very spine chilling. These seven behemoths, really came together, do it. And now you need what is called a global regulation of artificial intelligence before it is too late, before the genie is out of bottle, for instance. And people have spoken. Indian Prime Minister spoke the other day, about global regulation and ethical. Lot of those things, Chat GPT and plenty of those things. When you open any account, etc., says that, can I help you? I am available. I am your servant. You don't know what is there, for instance. Large number of things which are going on. So there is a risk that you are entering into an uncharted area. The future will look to be very risky. You could be monitored, for instance, without even knowing, that you are already being, your talks, your footprint, where you go, what you do. It could be immediately done if there is a small chip which is planted on your mobile phone, or somebody has cracked your mobile, and planted something. So a lot of those things, and this could be done easily through artificial intelligence, including warfare. So I think here are the issues where you need to really take a call. You have these things like chemicals and waste. There are 3 conventions which came together: persistent organic pollution, hazardous waste disposal, or chemicals in international trade. Huge amount of those chemicals, and waste which are doing the round, because that is exactly the economy and the society which you created. So we have to take a call. I am sure these are the debates we need to have in our classrooms. We need to really see what things affect us all around us. For instance, somewhere if you go to those huge landfills, for instance, like Ghazipur and elsewhere, you can see the kind of the dirt which you create. How much you really consume. You really over consume and over waste. Plenty of things which you don't need. So you have to have sustainable lifestyle, sustainable, plenty of those things. Otherwise, there is no end in sight. You have the sea level rise, where again it's vanishing. Lot of those things which are happening, where there is a international law commission which is now seized of the things. There are some principles which have been drafted, but ILC will take a lot of time, and that per se will not lead anything. Sea level rise is almost becoming a reality because of the thermal expansion of the ocean, because the temperatures are rising. And if the sea level rises to beyond a particular point, imagine the havoc it will cause. Probably those who come from coastal towns of India, you'll know that every year there is an intrusion of the sea water into many of those areas. Each year, fertile land becomes barren. So I think it's going to be a new reality in the day, and you have to see that how do you take a call on this. All that habitation, how fertile land which is available, it will be shrinking. So I think the sea level rise will be one of the important things. The huge amount of prediction like the WMO itself does. So question is, how do you take a call? What do you do the future of the cities and coastlines and your all those things, infrastructure projects which you create, at a great expense, Cyclones comes, hurricanes come, when they strike, they destroy. They have a ferocious capacity. Like when you saw it, like when a cyclone was to strike the Gujarat coast, everything was evacuated because nothing could be stopped. Nothing could be stopped. Human beings still don't have the capacity to counter those natural calamities, earthquake, tsunami, cyclones. You just watch with horror, like you saw it the other day, Morocco, earthquake, completely destruction, or floods in Libya, 5,000 people washed away, or like in our own Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, where the land is caving in, highways are crumbling. Simla city, they say probably, you never know. One fine morning you'll try to find out where is Shimla. It could happen. So these are the things which you have already created. These are the years of neglect, years of doing too much pressure on the same limited resources. We need to really find the answers, Like you see, the destruction. This was the Libya floods. This is something in Syria. And you need to now work. I think I'm sure the law school shall have to little give a thought to what is called the international disaster law. We need to put together the instruments and possibilities, how at the domestic level as well as the global level. And also you need some kind of a firefighter, global firefighter. You have nothing. Individual countries like India sent out the Operation Dost when the earthquake struck, on Turkish-Syrian border, for instance. Individual countries, you don't have a global mechanism which will, like we have the national disaster, entire mechanism under the national disaster law, etc. At the global level, you need, because these are bound to happen. Natural calamities, man-made disasters and natural calamities. Question is, look at the death and destruction. This is one side. Second is the man-made, the warfare. In fact, I had a chance to speak to the former president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I asked him the question. I said, Peter, how do you muster the courage, going from Democratic Republic of Congo to Haiti to Yemen to Ukraine, You see the death and destruction, the bodies are lying, the ruins, And he said, because I am convinced I have optimism. That some of these forces are not invincible. Those who cause this death and destruction, they are not invincible. So you hope against hope. Deliberate destruction of the things takes place. Human lives are lost. Displacement takes place. And I think those of you who are familiar, they say the stories in cities like, in Germany, France, the migrant population standing on the subways, railway stations, begging for it, asking just for food. Some of my students, they told me that when they offered money, they said, no, we don't want food. We don't want money. Please give us food. Please buy something sandwich for me. I'm hungry. My baby is hungry. She needs baby food. Huge amount of those migrants who are just pushed out, So these are the real challenges. You have to face it. You have to face it. Because otherwise they will end up living, as you know, most of the second-class citizen is most of the recipient. At least it's a good thing, nice thing, the humanitarian assistance is provided. But no one wants to leave his or her home or earth, Don't want to leave your country, for instance, You want a safety. And also, huge trafficking is at work. Once you become vulnerable, the global trafficking, racketeering, huge amount, and women and children, large number of people become vulnerable to the trafficking. Unbelievable things, I don't want to give you the figure, otherwise, it will spoil your mood, In India alone, some 13 million women have disappeared in last 5 years. 13 million, 1.3 million. Where did they go? Who took them away? It's one of the biggest challenge. And you have a global convention on human trafficking. So you have the instrument. You have to plug those loopholes. You know how much, like from my own home state, a family of 4, last year they were smuggled out, taken to the Canadian-US border, and they were frozen to death. Frozen to death. All 4 perished. And Canadian government, ordered an inquiry. यहाँ किसी के पेट का पानी नहीं हिला. No one was perturbed about it. How come the 4 people were frozen to death? They are from a reasonably comfortable family. And people are dying. You need to see how the US-Mexican border, where the things work. People are desperate to leave. Desperate to leave. India also, there are figures which the minister has given in the Parliament of India. Last year alone, 80,000 people left Indian citizenship. 80,000 people. Why do the people leave? You have to find answers to, because there is no answer. There is no solution by simply this kind of a big migration. There are no heavens anywhere available, You need to find local answers, And as I said, the disaster law, I wrote one of the earliest article. If you have the interest, please read in the social science and medicine. This was the only time when my article was given the title of what I told Shrijit is the third word by the editor, because the editor liked third word. So he changed my word from the developing country to third word. And this is available where I had predicted, in 1990 as a student, the Comprehensive Global Convention on Mass Disasters encompassing sharing of the data and transfer of disaster management technology to developing countries is now need of the hour. 1990. And this has now become much more relevant that you need a disaster law to be formulated. On energy thing, Again, huge global energy transition you will need to really address, in terms of whether you have the geothermal, wind energy, and other alternative sources. Though you need to have the processes and the structures ready for the energy future, which will be coming in the future. You must be ready once the fossil fuel goes away, and that itself will take, we don't know, at least 50 years or so. There is no end in sight. People are not willing to, because the fossil fuel lobby is not going to give up very easily. And I think you need to be ready with these alternative sources of energy, because that is going to be the future. Some of the European countries have already started doing it. France has done it, Germany has done it, many of the countries. But they have the wherewithal, they have the resources. What about large number of the developing countries, though? And country of India's size, 1/6 of the global population. You need huge amount of that energy. That is why India is hesitant, from not the coal phase out, but phase down. We are hesitant because how do the people need the energy? And biodiversity, again, there is a huge cost when you want to have a transition, conservation of biodiversity. Some 500 billion worth of annual subsidies you need to really phase out. I am just mentioning some of the areas where international law instrumentality shall have to be tightened. Time will not permit me to go into the details, etc. Climate change, again I mentioned about this huge climate change conundrum. There is a special issue of climate change which is available, where again it presents the additional challenge from international law scholars, the UN General Assembly and UN FCCC process to make it work. Need to elevate the normative ambit of the climate change regulation as one of the planetary concerns. This is one of the important aspects, that from a merely common concern, the climate change issue has to be elevated to planetary concern, where more higher normative threshold will apply. You need to elevate so that it assumes a priority. Immediate course correction will be required, And I think this is exactly where the states shall have to, like when you talk about the COP28 meeting taking place in Dubai in November, for instance, show goes on, but no dramatic results will come out. You need, and this is exactly where the task is cut out for the scholars, that we need to move and think in those directions. And finally, this what I call the international wildlife law, where you saw continental translocation of the wildlife, for instance, the cheetah translocation. This could be in the future where a lot of countries could, and we did it. It was very adventurous on the part of India to bring the cheetahs from Namibia and South Africa, but you need the regulatory framework, domestic conservation and at the global level. And finally, let me end with what, again, Professor Anand's that article of 1980. I'll read out these 3 paragraphs and then I'll wind up. We require not only a new perception of a man's relationship with natural world, but with man's relationship with man. The problems of the rich cannot be seen in isolation from those of the poor. Indeed, in all respects, we inhabit only one world. Like you saw India's, this mantra was, one family, one world, one future. It's one world. The new ecological imperative can certainly give mankind a new vision and incentive for operation at various levels. Idea of common worldwide policies and strategies seems strange at present, because the world institutions are not backed by any sense of planetary community and commitment. 1980, 43 years ago, what he mentioned, that you don't have that planet-wide. After 43 years ago, this is now staring us in the face. You never ever had that wider, जो कहते हैं ना कि आपकी कहते हैं ना कि सब हिंदी में कहावत, there is a saying in Hindi that निशान चुक माफ, नहीं माफ, नीचा निशान. Your aim has to be high. You must have a wider horizons. You must think aloud and ahead. When I mention about those three curating books, this is exactly what I ask each of the author. Think aloud and ahead. Please think 50 years hence. What will be the future like? What processes and the structures that you need? What course correction you need, so that the things don't reach a kind of a point, And finally, our ultimate loyalty to our single, beautiful, but vulnerable planet Earth, And I think finally let me read out one single line from the Limits to Growth report, 200-page report, the last line, which will be very, very relevant, which I found, that the crux of the matter is not only whether the human species will survive, but even more, whether it can survive without falling into a state of worthless existence. Do you really prefer a worthless existence, or you want to have a fully livable life of a human being, which can really be empathetic to our other species on the planet Earth and the future of the planet Earth itself, And I'll finally end, because you speak in Sanskrit of Vidvan Sarvatra Pujyate. I really admire and appreciate that the Jindal took the initiative to pay homage and respect to my former esteemed teacher, a scholar. And as they say, it could have been done in my own home turf, my university itself. But if Jindal does it, so be it. And a scholar will be like a giant tree, banyan tree, who will give a shelter to the people. We must imbibe the spirit of this kind of thing. We must value the scholars and the scholarship. And also, as I said, our primary instrumentality, to ensure that make international law work, take international law seriously. And I'm sure that what I tried, in the footstep of my own esteemed teacher, I hope I made him proud. I'm sure wherever he is, he'll say, he used to always say, I'm a very happy young man, and I hope wherever he is, he'll feel happy. I tried my best. He used to always ask me, Bharat, books matter only, books. And by the time the books came, he was gone. He went too early. I really miss him, and I hope whatever the little work I could do, I really, pay my tribute to my esteemed teacher. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. As always. Please join us.
If there is any question or query to anybody, please feel free. Otherwise, my email is there. You may send me an email. If there is any meaningful query, or I thought to let the message at least creeping, because I've given too much heavy stuff. I don't think but I'm sure at least you must think about it, and hopefully it will yield some churning future careers, or at least to make you more sensitive to the surroundings, or your existence, your institution where you work, or your teachers and your country.
Thank you, Professor Desai, for taking the time to be here today. And I would like to thank my assistant deans as part of the special initiatives effort to also have taken the time to put this together. Professor Srijit and Professor Patnaik again for being here and gracing this occasion with their presence. And last but not least, all of you for having taken time from your schedules to be here. The first step towards solving any problem, more often than not, is just recognizing that there is one. And when we talk about environmental law, I think it's more and more important that we have more conversations like this. So thank you very much. And please be seated just for a few minutes until the dignitaries leave, and then you can follow suit. All right. Thank you. I would request you all to stay back for just 2 minutes after, and then you can leave.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
I hope you've all filled your attendance sheets. Yes?